delivers his talk. So, good to see you, Neil. How are you doing?
Yeah, pretty well, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you well.
Oh, great.
Coming in loud and clear.
Well, it's nice to be back. I'm a wee bit run off my feet with one thing or another, so it's a pleasure to be back and talking to you all.
Good stuff. So I've got your PowerPoint.
Right.
And I will change the slides under your direction, whenever you want me to do that.
That's great. Okay.
So shall we say it's just after 1:15. So if you'd just like to take it away, that'd be great.
Okay. First, I didn't quite see when I just came in. I came in late as well today. Sorry about that. I couldn't get access with the Cisco Spark thing. How many people am I talking to today?
4.
All right. Well, hello, everybody.
Hi.
Well, I'll just get started then. Today I'd like to discuss the poet Norman McCaig, his life and his connection to the Highlands. I must admit that when I started reading up on Norman McCaig, I didn't really remember all that much about him, except what I'd learned a long time ago at school. As it turns out, McCaig's links to the Highlands, both in terms of place and spirit, make him a good choice as a figure that we, doing this module, can point to as a noteworthy writer who was sensitive to his place, his history, and his people. My hope here is to establish McCaig as a poet who's capable of responding seriously to the Highland landscape, and in particular, his beloved Assynt. Next slide, please. In order to do that, I'm going to first give a short overview of the poet's life. Then I'll look at an important criticism of McCaig as an engaged poet of nature. And finally, I'll conclude with a few remarks focusing on McCaig's successes in putting his responses to the Highlands on paper. So that's the basic plan of my little talk, a biography, a little bit of a discussion of some pretty important criticism that's come his way, and then finally a little wrap-up about McCaig and rural poetry. Next slide, please. So, first of all, let me remind you, if you're not particularly familiar with McCaig, about his life. He had family connections to the Hebrides, in particular Harris. His mother's native Gaelic was not passed on to him, although he knew a lot of the language, and he could talk about its qualities and its literary history. He was born in Edinburgh in 1910 and called himself a three-quarter Gael, 3 grandparents being from Gaeldom and 1 from Dumfriesshire. And in Edinburgh, he grew up and spent most of his life. He became a conscientious objector in the war years and was imprisoned for 93 days in Wormwood Scrubs, which, if you don't know, is a rather notorious London prison. In the 1930s, after the war, he found Assynt in West Sutherland and went, and for the next 4 decades, spent a couple of months there every summer. By the end of the 40s, he'd met and befriended the important literati of the day, and he counted Hugh MacDiarmid, Sidney Goodsir Smith, and Sorley MacLean amongst his friends. Next slide, please. So, they used to gather in pubs mostly for their meetings. Debate would become heated, especially if MacDiarmid was around. The old man of Scottish letters could be sharp, and McCaig stood out from the crowd in several ways. He was taller than just about everybody, and also, unlike the other writers, he wrote in exact mannered English, not Scots or Gaelic. In the politically charged discussions in the Edinburgh pubs, the choice of English as the language of poetry was perhaps not best appreciated by everybody. Still, MacDiarmid took a liking to McCaig, protected him from a lot of the criticism that came his way, and their relationship went on to be quite a close one. Asked after MacDiarmid's death whether the dynamic between the old man and the youth had been filial, McCaig replied, typically contrarian, "Yes, in a way he was my son." The visits to Assynt kept to schedule. McCaig had found work as a primary school teacher, so his retreats to Sutherland could be enjoyed over quite long school summer holidays, and the poetry kept coming too. In the 50s, he had abandoned the New Apocalypse movement after publishing a couple of books, and he had reinvented his poetry, and this culminated in the publication of his first real book, as he put it, Riding Lights. He put some of the impetus for that change on a remark made to him one day. A baffled friend had handed him back a copy of one of his early books and asked when he would be publishing the answers. McCaig took the comment to heart, calling it the most useful criticism he'd ever received, and began, as he put it, the long haul to lucidity. In 1955, the collection Riding Lights was published, and from this point, the poet published fairly consistently until his collected poems in 1989. In his writing life, he found influences in Rainer Maria Rilke, the Americans William Carlos Williams and Wallace Stevens, as well, of course, in his friends closer to home. MacDiarmid bantered with McCaig constantly, and for most part good-naturedly. The two were utterly unlike in terms of politics, temperament and aesthetics. Neil Gunn and Edwin Muir, although older by a generation, had in common a distaste of political stances which were dogmatic or aggressive, and this sat more easily with McCaig than the irascible Caledonian antizyzogy. The younger generation of George Mackay Brown and Ian Crichton Smith were people McCaig could relate to more easily, since they were less politically strident, tending to focus more on the theme of possibilities of regeneration and building. Throughout his life, McCaig both accepted and rejected being categorised as metaphysical. He loved contradictions and contrariness, and was quite proud of the fact that he could be difficult sometimes. The Irish poet Seamus Heaney found much in common with McCaig and became a friend. He summed up McCaig with a simple statement, "He means poetry to me." And elsewhere he states, "I've always loved the mixture of strictness and susceptibility in Norman McCaig's work. It's an ongoing education in the marvellous possibilities of lyric poetry." "Landscape is my religion," McCaig once said, and one of his books was the 1966, simply titled Surroundings. Next slide, please. He would have travelled more if he'd enjoyed travelling more, but he had no appetite for it, despite some of his best-known poems being set in Italy, like Assisi and the streets of Florence. Assynt had all he seemed to need. He loved its geography and geology. Situated in the northwest corner of the Highlands of Scotland and set amidst some of the wildest and most remote mountain scenery, Assynt is a legacy of glaciation, and much of the hinterland consists of rugged, distinctive and isolated mountains sitting among large tracts of open moorland and bog. Lochs and lochans dot the place. McCaig said that he liked to know that when he went fishing there was no one within 5 miles of him, and you can imagine that he got what he wanted most of the time in Assynt. You're more likely to see deer than you are human beings. McCaig said it was the geology of the landscape that was the bones of its beauty. Next slide, please. Here's McCaig's solipsistic little gem, So Many Summers. Set in Assynt. And it'll be on page 2 if you've got my handout. Set in Assynt and drawing landscape and human history together, and finally pulling the construct inward to self-reflection. Next slide, please. So, on to the criticism that I mentioned. Of all the criticisms which have been levelled at McCaig, one seems particularly stinging. It was printed in the context of one of the UK's foremost eco-critics, what 30 years ago you might call an environmental literature critic or a green specialist. Terry Gifford's survey of pastoral poetry, a book which has had a fair amount of influence on the field of literary responses to ecology or eco-criticism. The remark is Terry Gifford's in his 1995 book, Green Voices, which is a critical examination of the pastoral in modern English language poetry. And it's the book which helped establish Gifford's reputation. Neatly formulated by Tonya Payne, another eco-critic, Gifford believes that a certain type of poetry can be helpful to our understanding of our relationships with and assumptions about nature. One of his fundamental questions is, in order to achieve poetry's goal of facilitating this understanding, whether it's aesthetics or consciousness raising which is most important. Gifford's answer is that it's aesthetics. Poetry must work as good poetry in order to move the reader and thus be appreciated as a beautiful work of art, and at the same time it may then work to raise consciousness of eco-critical concerns. Gifford's overall argument is, he says that, and I quote, "While poetry makes nothing happen, it can contribute to a shift in sensibility rather than lifestyle," end quote. He introduces questions in his book such as what makes good eco-poetry and by what exemplars do we recognise it. Next slide, please. One of his criteria for the success of any poem is whether it acknowledges the human nature connection within specific history of a specific culture in a particular place. This is an important premise in Gifford's anti-McCaig argument, so I'll rephrase it. Does the poem recognise the immediacy of the relationship between human and landscape, or does it gloss over that relationship or ignore that relationship? Next slide, please. Gifford is interested in identifying and contrasting pastoral poetry with what he has called post-pastoral poetry. He identifies three main uses of pastoral. The first usage denotes the specific literary form with its roots in Greek and Roman poetry, in which the countryside is represented in an idealized manner. You can think of a society of shepherds being free from the complexity and the corruption of city life. Many of the idylls written in the pastoralist mode are far remote from the realities of any life, be it rustic or urban. Among the writers who have famously used the pastoral are Theocritus, Virgil, the English poets Edmund Spenser, Robert Herrick, Shelley and Matthew Arnold. And the dynamic of retreat in pastoral poetry is sometimes used to reflect on the situation of the urban audience rather than the urban poet. In the second of Gifford's definitions, it's a rather vague definition. It simply talks about the content. Pastoral poetry must have a focus on the natural world or on a rural setting. The first two definitions of pastoral are only form and content. The third use is pejorative, and it's this one that we're interested when it comes to McCaig. Gifford uses it to mean that the pastoral vision is limited or incomplete because it fails to address the harsh reality of rural existence. In his scheme, pastoral is something of an accusative term. This type of poetry is guilty of presenting an idealized description of a supposedly real place. This constitutes an aspect of nostalgia which locates and fixes nature in the past such that it's denied the option of change, as if nature were untouched or untouchable. Pastoral, then, is part of our main problem with nature, alienation. Gifford believes that post-pastoral eco-poetry has a better chance of confronting this alienation, but I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm just interested in the accusation of pastoral. So it's worth stressing that as part of a longer discussion on Gifford's idea of the pastoral trap that we encounter this criticism of McCaig. At the start of Gifford's discussion, Gifford situates himself with regards to McCaig, and I'll read what he says. One of the most popular contemporary Scottish poets, who is well known throughout the rest of Britain and writes about the mountains of the northwest of Scotland, is Norman McCaig. For his 80th birthday, Chatto and Windus published his collected poems, and there appeared the inevitable critical essays from Scottish academics in generous mood. Gifford now turns to these birthday essays and the depiction of McCaig. And he says, one review essay is a good example of the way in which what elsewhere might be regarded as weaknesses in the poetry become indicators of McCaig's achievement. In fact, despite a few poems of whimsical uncertainty about McCaig's relationship to the natural world, his poetry celebrates the unproblematic relationship of an escapist to nature. Finally, Gifford explains that these are two sides of the same pastoralist coin. McCaig's poetry fails to transcend the nature of his reality, of his working in Edinburgh and his holidaying at his cottage in Assens. Next slide, please. So there appear to be three claims here. The first two are linked, and they state that McCaig managed only a few poems of whimsical uncertainty about his relationship to the natural world, to contrast with the rest of his nature poetry, which Gifford suggests is light tourism. This can be disputed by showing that there are more than a few poems which concern McCaig's relationship to the natural world, and that at least some of them have more heft to them than whimsy. The second claim is that the poetry consistently and myopically celebrates the unproblematic relationship of an escapist to nature. Since Gifford makes some more specific remarks about this point, I'll deal with them later on individually. The linking principle in my response to Gifford's criticisms is not so much the idea of nature, but the idea of place and McCaig's understanding of that. So, a few poems of whimsical uncertainty. Let me start with Gifford's claim of the lack of a substantial body of nature poetry to begin with. So I mentioned that this claim could be overturned by simply counting the number of poems that McCaig wrote about his experiences with nature. It seems to be a really extraordinary claim, and I wonder what Gifford, if he had something else in mind. McCaig's collected poems of 2005 have about 800 poems in them, and there are a great many of them which are concerned with nature poetry. I'll skip over the exact numbers and simply say that a great number of them, you only need to flip through the contents page of his book to find a lot of nature poetry. It's disingenuous to say that McCaig didn't write much poetry to do with nature. Next slide, please. So, to whimsy. In fact, McCaig would probably have enjoyed being accused of being daft. Marshall Walker, in his Scottish Literature since 1707, writes, "Few poets are so unegotistical, so lacking in posture." Could it be this that confuses Gifford? McCaig positively revels in playfully advancing and retreating if his poetry or if his thinking ever calls for a first person or an I in the poem. The well-known poem, A Man in My Position, bears this point out. This is also in your handout on page 3. Hear my words carefully. Some are spoken not by me, but by a man in my position. Perhaps it is whimsical. About romanticism, McCaig had this to say: its falsity and its overblown rhetoric for feelings that are trifling in the first place. Its sentimentality is too far removed from reality. I'm quoting him here simply to argue that if the romantic component of rural poetry is suspect in McCaig's mind, then it's not hard to imagine that on principle at least he didn't have much time for the pastoral. I can't find anything that McCaig wrote in prose on his opinions of the pastoral, but he did write one poem and called it that. It's on page 3 of your handout. Next slide, please. I won't waste time reading it out, but I'll move on. He was far too aware of himself and the absence of complicating metaphor to really believe that he was writing a pastoral, wide-eyed, credulous. This poem is almost akin to the doggerel on smoking and drinking to ensure longevity. The poem is populated with comedic figures and anthropomorphism. It's a pastoral, yes, but of a ridiculous scene. He's lambasting the idea of pastoral. It's a piece of humour, which is a metonymic prod at the whole idea of the pastoral. So, about the accusation of whimsy, I think we can answer that while McCaig is completely guilty of that, he's not blithely ignorant of the human relationship to the natural world. Just the opposite. He problematizes it and explores the difficult consequences of examining that which would be allowed to go unchallenged. I'd like to show one more example of this before moving on. It'll bridge us to the next part anyway. Next slide, please. I wonder if you've read Summer Farm. It's a well-known poem. I offer it to you here just as an example of the metaphysical McCaig, and also of the poet actively engaging in finding his place in the landscape, through the landscape. So, to move on to place. Gifford's third criticism is that McCaig celebrates the unproblematic relationship of an escapist to nature. McCaig certainly found solace and simple joy in Assynt, and there seems to be no doubt that his journey from Edinburgh was certainly an escape at times, towards sanctuary, towards the countryside. But I think that this criticism of Gifford's is fairly easy to debunk, more so than it first seems. It's important to divorce the biography from the writing. McCaig did escape to Assynt, but when he was there, he was gathering his thoughts and gathering material as well. He didn't usually do very much writing when he was there. He preferred to do it when he got back to Edinburgh. And so when he returned to Edinburgh, he'd start to assemble his poetry. His writing habit was very simple. He lit a cigarette and wrote. If he didn't like the result, it went into the bin. So here he describes his views on writing. I'll quote him a little bit. He says, "Many poets polish and refine and eliminate and add, making version after version of the original attempt. I can't do that. The poem, whatever it's worth, generally comes easily and quickly, and pretty often with no correction at all. And once it's on the page, that's that. The pleasure in making poems lies in making them." To assent to Gifford's requirements that poetry be post-pastoral all the time is, I think, to ignore poetry's other functions and a great deal of the history of our poetry in Scotland. So I'll restrict my comments to those examples of McCaig attempting to engage with the landscape, of which there are already enough to go far beyond the time I have for the talk. Next slide, please. Let me start with a poem that Gifford singles out as the definitive example of McCaig's form of escapism, The Pass of the Roaring. Here it is. I'm interested in just the first stanza. "Such comfortless places comfort me," says McCaig. Gifford's main problem, though, is in the final two lines. Next slide, please. Well, Gifford says that whilst unstun is an unusually effective verb, it's undone by the following line, which reveals it to be part of an escapist process. This perverse idea that there's no history in what is likely in this poem to be Sutherland, he says, can only come from an escapist weekender. Next slide, please. Gifford claims the suspicion is confirmed in the final stanza. There is always a returning. Gifford concludes the effect of tall cliffs in unstunning the mind has merely resulted in this ahistorical slump into the grace of the Northwest Highlands. But I disagree. Let's look at the first stanza again. The poet is seeking comfort, and he gets it by experiencing a sudden, shocking meeting with the sublime. His brain, so used to rattling away, is shocked to silence. He encounters a minimal reality, bold, stark rock and secretive, thin water. He's at a place where no history passes him. His mind is cleared of everything but the simplest consciousness of timeless events. The rock seems never to move, the waters seem to never swell, the body's needs fade, and the I, which is always ambiguous in McCaig, always elusive and always on the run, is stilled and fed. There's elemental peace here. Gifford is right about the interesting verb unstun, but he's wrong that it's merely decorative. It indicates a reversal of the usual processes of life, and among them history-making. The sublime moment of McCaig being unstunned lifts the burden of history from his usual conscious thoughts. For a moment, he's outside time. He's graced with a shocked peacefulness. This is why in the last stanza there's always a returning. Not because the scene was a pastoral in Gifford's pejorative sense, but because time and history are too powerful to delay forever. The poet returns to the fireside and slumps at the weight of the world coming back to his shoulders. He's experienced an otherworldly reprieve, but it fades, and it's replaced with something more comprehensible, human communication. The real is ultimately seen to be at least as worthwhile as the supernatural or the semi-divine experience. Next slide, please. This is a theme, this idea of the real being seen as equally important and equally valuable as the supernatural. This theme has been used by McCaig before. He used it before he wrote The Pass of the Roaring. He used it in Incident, which is on page 6 of your handout. This sees McCaig sitting across from a lover and experiencing the impossible and the possible at the same time. At the end of the poem, next slide, please. At the end of the poem, he's graced with the opportunity to act in the real world, which of course he does with relief and engagement. I give you one with a hand that trembles with a human trembling. It's the moving away from the supernatural back to the normal, back to the real. This is the same return to human communication that occurs in the Pass of the Roaring. It occurs after an important mental and spiritual event. So I think this is a fairly typical McCaig motif. Next slide, please. McCaig may not have written his views on the pastoral in essay form, but he fairly explicitly explains why he objects to it in his poem Birds All Singing. In it, he describes a scene or a moment in nature which on the surface appears to be pastoral, but in fact all the actors in it are behaving in a realistic and selfish way, and they're all misunderstanding their situation. As false as a machine, in the second line. As false as a machine is one of McCaig's apt contradictions. The metaphor seems out of place in a nature scene, and so is the human figure's misinterpretation. The figure in this pastoral scene observes the singing birds and the land rolled out before him, and believes it to be all for him. He misunderstands the purpose of the birdsong and misreads the landscape, believing that some force or right allows him to enjoy the experience as an owner admires a painting. McCaig is capturing both human arrogance and a more nuanced view of nature than any pastoral would allow. So, I've tried to defend McCaig against the accusation of being alienated from nature and participating in the pastoral mode's homocentric arrogance. I've very quickly covered McCaig himself and one of his most eminent, dismissive, and I think mistaken critics. And we've seen a few of the poems which serve to illustrate just a little of the poet's interest in place and his love of landscape. So, thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Neil. That was extremely interesting, extremely well done as well. I haven't handed out the handouts yet. I've got that. I didn't have a chance, so the handouts will be going to everyone else so that they can read the poems. But we're perfectly able to see the poems on the screen and to read them. And you were pointing out the important parts of them, so that's excellent. Yeah, I think you made a very good case, presented the evidence that McCaig was fully aware of what he was doing, and that Gifford's criticism was misjudged. I think that you've certainly made that case. I've just got a sort of question. I suppose it comes from ignorance rather than anything else. But who decided that poetry needed to present the harsh reality of landscape, and what's wrong with escapism?
Well, to answer that question, I suppose I should put on the Gifford hat. I think he would probably say that we have a responsibility to respond in an authentic way to the landscape, and part of that responsibility is recognizing that the landscape is mutable, changing, and that we have an effect on the landscape, and it has an effect on us. The pastoral, I think he would say anyway, that the pastoral denies us the chance of recognizing these complications, that what it does is it only allows us a certain limited engagement with the landscape. But yes, who says that we should always be 100% thinking about the more complicated issues of the countryside and landscape? I think maybe it has to do with the genre, the type of criticism that eco-criticism is, that it is very interested in that point, in pushing its agenda there. But as I mentioned in the presentation, there maybe too briefly, but most of the history of poetry in English, poetry I think in Scots and Gaelic, has to do with a fairly well-meaning and relatively simple appreciation of landscape. It doesn't necessarily engage with the complications of it, and that doesn't mean that it's in any way worse poetry than the kind of poetry that Gifford would celebrate. So yes, it's a good point.
Thank you very much. I'll ask the others to ask a question as well. Just one last one though. The Glen of the Roaring, or was it the Valley of the Roaring? That's obviously a translation from Gaelic. Do you happen to know what source it came from?
I don't. Thank you, though. That's a really interesting point. I don't know. I'll have to have a look.
Yeah. It might not be, but to me it sounds like it's could have come from Donachaban Machenpur or someone like that. Because that's it sounds like a place name that's been translated from Gaelic into English. The Roaring of the Stag.
Now that you say it was, wasn't it? Yes. Yeah. Yes, I'll see if I can find out anything about it.
Thank you very much. Okay, now, Erin, Joe, Fiona, what would you like to ask Neil?
You decide on him to present to us?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
I was just curious as to why you decided on him, on this poet, specifically to present to us, to share with us in class.
Right. Well, personally, he just stuck in my mind. I remembered him from years ago. I remembered enjoying Summer Farm, one of the poems we were looking at there, and I had it in my mind that it would be interesting just to read a bit more about him and learn more about him. But it fitted quite nicely with the instructions for this presentation, because although I've lost them now, I can't remember where I read it, but one of the instructions was to try to find a link between our presentation topic and our course. And so having a quick look through on the internet, I think, about McCaig, I thought, wow, this is great. It turned out that he had a stronger connection to the Gaeldom and the north of Scotland than I remembered. So it was a bit of good luck.
Oh.
Thank you very much, Erin. Joe, Fiona, do you have a question?
No,
Hi, Joe.
afraid not. Hiya. I thought it was quite interesting that you chose a poet to present to us rather than, somebody who wrote travel journals or something like that. I thought that was really interesting, so thank you.
Oh, thanks.
I don't know if Fiona's still with us or not.
Doesn't look so.
So, well, thank you very much, Neil. One of the poems by Norman McCaig that I particularly like, which is connected to what you've been saying and also connects into our theme in this module, is Climbing Sullivan, which, well, there's just some beautiful images in it. Well, I don't know if they're beautiful. They're realistic images, okay? Non-pastoral images. Like my shadow jumps huge miles away from me. He really captures the feeling of climbing Sullivan. I claw that tall horizon down to this. So you get the feeling of the struggle to reach the top of Sullivan, and he's doing something that I want to talk a little bit about next week, if I have time, which is hill walking, mountaineering, and its connection to the Highland Tour, because that's one of the things that's come out of it. Come out of the 19th century exploration of the Highlands was this realization that you could connect to the sublime by climbing hills and mountains, and well, McCaig is doing that in this particular poem. And we look at this one, well, a little bit in the other module, Writers in Place, which I'll obviously have to do a bit more detail on next time, because you'll be in the class, Neil, and McCaig is obviously something of great interest to you, so we might call on you to do some material for that. But I don't know if you know this poem.
I looked at it. I was considering including it in my presentation for the reason that you mentioned, that wonderful image of the shadow jumping huge miles away at the end. It's a great image, and you're right. It's quite realistic. When you claw your way up the side of a hill, and the sun is in just that position, so that when you finally make the break, it gets you, and you can see your shadow. Yeah. Great.
Good stuff. Right. Sorry. Any other comment or?
Well,
Okay.
they have to not sue him. He's poor.
Sorry.
The owner of the blog.
I didn't quite catch that, Erin. Sorry.
Oh, no, I'm reading on the side, the owner of the
Oh,
blog.
the owner of the blog. Yeah.
Please don't sue me. I'm poor.
I wonder if that works if you're taken to court. Sorry, I can't pay the fine. I'm poor. Okay, that was splendid. That was very thought provoking, and it's taken us in a slightly different direction from some of the other material we've looked at. But it's all connected, and it does connect into one of the other modules that those on HighlandsHighland literature will be looking at. So yes, very good indeed. And it did give me the opportunity to mention hill walking. So that means I'll do a little bit more of that next week. So thank you very much, Neil.
Oh, thanks for listening.
Right, how are we doing? Oh, well, actually, I think it seems like a perfect hiatus. It's a wee bit early, but I think if we stop now for 5 minutes to grab ourselves a cup of tea, that would be a good opportunity. And those who haven't heard of or read Norman McCaig before, hope you'll be inspired by Neil's presentation to go and explore one of Scotland's great modern poets. And also start thinking, while getting a cup of tea, about the Highlands and Islands in film, and this sort of virtual travellers to the expected pastoral Highlands.